apparently there's a lot of evidence that elephants have some notion of death. They have they have these boneyards where they go and they have they seem to have these rituals uh, when another elephant dies, and so
And I had a cat who was attacked by either a dog or a wild animal, and he was older, Leon, and he was, I think, 17 years old, and his kidney shut down. And the veterinarian said that is very, very common for an older animal when it has shock to have organ failure. And so we tried to work with him to see if we couldn't jumpstart the kidneys, but it was nothing was happening. And so, but my point is, my cat did not want me anywhere around him.
hmm.
I mean, it was, and what I have heard from many, many people who have had cats, a cat wants to die by itself. That it will literally, even if it's dragging itself, it will try to not have any anybody else around it. And I've heard that from at least a dozen people. And so to me, that at least, and I'm not being facetious, Eric. I think this is a very important point. That it seems like a cat or cats in general. I would just say house cats do have a sense of. I don't want to say they have a concept of death, but they have a concept of something's really, really bad happening, and they could be in pain, something's going wrong physically, and they don't want to be around either other animals or other cats, pets, or they don't want to be around the people that, whose household they've been a part of.
Yeah, but I think to have authentic being toward death, you would have to do something like realize that you're a finite creature and that all of your projects are going to come to an end at some point in the future, and have sort of that future forward facing sense of your life, that your life is, I don't know how else to put it, and projected forward into these projects and so on. So, I mean, it does seem to me that a lot of animals do have some, I don't know if they have any sense. So like with the cat thing, I don't know. I mean, I wonder whether they really know that they're dying or whether they just know that they're really messed up. That like their body's really, like things are just not working well and I feel like shit, something like that.
Well, he was injured before, and he didn't exhibit the same kind of behavior when he had injured himself. He had got, how well, you've got cats. You know how sometimes they'll be so stubborn and they must get into a place. And he forced himself through an opening, and he gave himself a really bad gash in his side that got infected. And I wasn't around a lot, so I didn't see it for like 3 days. So took him to the vet, and they shaved him, gave him a ton of antibiotics, drained it. And before that, he was in the living room, and he did not try to hide himself. So, but I understand your more general point, which is a kind of sense of finiteness. What you're suggesting is human beings have a sense of, we have a finite period of time on this world, and that changes perspective on life.
Did Chase say anything before he left? Huh.
No, I didn't see anything.
Yeah. Going to be interesting with just the three of us, I guess. It started out, this started out as the most the most attended seminar we've ever had with Heidegger, but then, as is often the case, we'll see. See, Matthew is often here, so I don't know. Well, in these sections, this first section, number 61, I can't honestly say that I got much out of it, but I think it, as Heidegger often does, I mean, he says preliminary sketch, and he's just kind of like giving an outline of where he's headed. And so I'm guessing he didn't expect me to get a lot out of section 61. He's just saying, here's a preliminary sketch of where we're headed. And then he throws out a bunch of stuff and about temporality. And it's like he seems to like be kind of throwing it. Here are some of the conclusions that I'm going to be defending, and without actually saying a whole lot about them there. So I don't know if you guys got anything more out of that section, but he just makes a lot of statements that I don't really understand how he got there, but I think it's kind of almost like I said, like reading an outline of where he's headed. So, I mean, like a big question, what does it mean by temporality and all that kind of stuff? But I assume he's going to be going into that in more detail later. I don't know if you guys had anything on section 61.
No.
It is not the same thing as time. Temporality. Got that.
Well, I'm just asking. I'm not, please feel free to say no. You couldn't be further from the truth. But is that was connected to what we were honestly talking about earlier? That if I'm not saying he's saying this, but just when you think of the concept of time, and in terms of Western culture, we have seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, right? So we have a sense of time in terms of this abstract divisions into different units. And so, in some kind of abstract way, we can say, oh, the movie lasted 2 hours. But I thought because he talk so much about individualized experience that temporality was more of a subjective kind of sense of time.
I think it's going to be like one of he keeps doing this over and over and over, where he says there is some existential ontological feature of Dasein that is the ground of possibility for something we have an everyday experience of. And so my guess he's going to end up saying something like temporality is this existential feature of Dasein that makes what you described possible. So abstract time is not temporality, and counting seconds is not temporality, but
Right.
our ability to do that is made possible by whatever temporality is, which, like I said, I don't have a great, I mean, but I think in general, you're right. It's this, this whole thing about Dasein is always ahead of itself. He says that, and that Dasein is its possibilities, which means, possibilities are always directed to the future in a way. And so there's something fundamental about Dasein that we are always on the way. We are always headed somewhere. And temporality is going to be something about that. And then because of that, then we generate these notions of time and seconds and so on. So I mean, one of the interesting things, and I think this is just a general characteristic of, I'm guessing, I don't know if Eric will disagree with me, but a phenomenology in general is it kind of reverses the abstract. I don't know what the other way to put it is. So, like in analytic philosophy and a lot of philosophy in the past, you would say, well, clearly we know that there's time. And we know objectively what time, we have all these objective truths, like we know what space is, we know what time is, and then we have all these subjective experiences that are distortions of that objective reality. And so I have this subjective sense of moving forward through time, and I have these projects that are in time and all of that. But those are just merely subjective interpretations of an absolute objective reality, which is time and space and, all these physical quantities. And phenomenology tends to flip that, in that what is primary and fundamental is what we have immediate and direct experience of, or like in the case of Heidegger, what we experience as constitutive of our being. That's what's primary, because that's what we that's what is actually. I mean, strangely, I want to say it's a Cartesian move, even though Heidegger really rebels against Descartes because the whole atomic self. But Cartesian in the sense of what you know best is what you discover in your immediate, concrete, lived experience. And so the fundamental reality for this primordiality for Heidegger is the fundamental of reality. And then all of these things like abstract time and abstract space, those are not the absolute objective realities. Those are actually interpretations of something that is more fundamental, which is what we experience as our being. And so he kind of flips that. And I think with temporality, he's doing, because he did that with space earlier, and now with temporality, because you don't remember, space was about this de-distancing. We experience things in this lived world of projects as being, the hammer is over there, it's not here. And then the notion of Cartesian coordinate space is actually an abstraction from that. And I think he's going to do something similar with temporality, that temporality is about this lived way we move through this sort of temporally conditioned experience. And then we have these abstract notions of time that you can count and all that kind of thing. That's my guess. He's going to make a similar kind of move there.
And also, I was going to give you, as counterintuitive as it might seem, because Heidegger does seem to be opposed to Descartes on several fronts. I think you're right to draw a relationship to Descartes, but I want to say the more direct link to Husserl, which
Yeah.
is the phenomenological method, and Husserl himself seeing that as potentially foundational, right? In terms of erecting a prima philosophy, yeah.
Yeah, I think that is the lineage. I think you're right. I mean, I have never read it, and I thought we should do a seminar on it sometimes, but now it's a hard book to get. But I've got a book called Cartesian Meditations by Husserl,
Right.
and I think you're exactly right, because Sartre makes the same statement. He says, I'm following Descartes in the sense that I believe that we should start with what we have most immediate direct access to. That's where we should start, rather than with some supposed objective world that would be the same regardless of whether any of us were in it or not. That's a fabrication. That's an interpretation.
It's starting out by begging the question.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think scientific realism begs the question.
Right.
They assume from the outset that there is this objective reality and blah blah blah, but phenomenology. And I think you're right though. So I'm just confirming that Husserl is drawing from that Cartesian viewpoint, and then you get it through Heidegger, and then probably from Husserl and Heidegger it comes into Sartre. So
I know this isn't what we were talking about, but is there have you identified any other sources for Husserl's ideas other than Descartes?
Yeah, Kant is a major kind of background voice that he tries to get away from, but doesn't quite.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I always found it funny when I've mostly read secondary sources, but early Husserl, from what I understand, is like, I'm not Kant, I'm not Kant, I'm not Kant. He keeps saying that. And then by the time he gets to the end of his project, the end of his life, he becomes a transcendental idealist and sounds a whole lot like Kant. So it's kind of funny. He's trying he's trying to get away from Kant, but then at the end he ends up sounding a whole lot like Kant. I mean, he's a self-avowed transcendental idealist by the end of his life, which is what and Kant, that's Kant's whole thing is transcendental idealism.
Right. I mean, I need to look more into Husserl, but my kind of distanced understanding is it is a more sophisticated version of what, Kant offered, nearly 100 and some odd years previously, right? So there's a lot of merit to it. I was also going to point out real quickly, Hegel, in the beginning of the Phenomenology of Spirit and in the beginning of the Science of Logic, also starts with the immediate, what presents itself directly to experience. However, with the important caveat, this is not a first foundation from which, but merely like a way in, an entry point, but not a foundation as such.
Which sounds a bit like Heidegger in the last part of this book, in the last part of our reading, this business about circularity.
That's right.
I know another source, big source for Husserl was Brentano, and I don't know a lot about Brentano, but he's sort of he was concerned with there's a Cambridge, if you're interested in Brentano, as there is for a lot of this stuff, there's a Cambridge companion to Brentano. Cambridge companion has, I don't know if maybe Ed, you're already aware, but it has a whole slew of companions to all sorts of philosophers and other people. And they have one for Brentano and also one from Husserl. But I don't know, how would you describe, I don't know a great deal about Brentano, but
Just intentionality.
intentionality. Yeah, he was doing what he called descriptive psychology, but he was trying to describe mental states in a sort of philosophically rigorous way.
Was
And
he writing in the second half of the 1800s?
probably. I would have to, I'd have to look.
And what I hate to ask this question, but what country was he from?
I'm guessing. I don't know. I shouldn't say.
Yeah, I mean,
good.
his first name is Franz, but his last name is Brentano. So probably not Swiss, but Swiss would be a good bet.
So I'm looking at actually, if you don't want a good place to start if you want to read is almost always the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and they have an article on Brentano. So yeah, he was 1838 to 1917.
Oh, okay.
So he says he was a charismatic teacher. He extended a strong influence on Husserl, Meinong, Christian von Ehrenfels, who I don't know, and Twardowski, Stumpf, and a bunch of others. I ran into Twardowski when I took that graduate class in so-called logic for philosophers. It was a required course that I almost died in. So Brentano, I guess it. Yeah, so I think he was, from what I remember, he was trying to do a rigorous descriptive psychology, and then in the hands of Husserl, that turned into phenomenology, which is, let's examine the phenomena as they appear to us, and
Right.
and be concerned with that. And so,
Right.
and then Brentano was big into Aristotle.
Oh.
So I don't know how much Husserl himself was deriving from Aristotle, but I'm sure if he didn't directly, he picked up a lot of Aristotle, because Brentano, he had a whole interpretation of Aristotle and his hylomorphism and all of that kind of stuff. So, and then also, I mean, Aristotle had a big influence on Hegel as well, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I want to say like all of the moderns still admire Aristotle. I want to say Aristotle's more like directly referred to, and Plato's more of a kind of like subterranean kind of influence, like Plato's there, but not often evoked as such, but Aristotle is often directly evoked.
And then my inexpert way of going from Husserl to Heidegger is that Husserl was concerned with consciousness, and again, kind of following this Cartesian first person kind of position. What I can experience, what I know most and best is what I can experience directly and immediately in my conscious awareness. And
Right.
so then phenomenology becomes the rigorous analysis of this kind of experience, conscious experience. And then Heidegger, this is my maybe simple-minded way of thinking, the transition shifts from that sort of consciousness and epistemological perspective to being in the world and this ontological experience. So for Husserl, the subject is the primary ground of experience. And you can see why he, drew for a lot from Kant, coming at it that way, that it is the subject and the subject's conscious awareness of experience that is the fundamental place from which you must begin. But then Heidegger shifts from conscious awareness to the experience of being, what it means to be in the world. And so in my way of thinking, Dasein is kind of the ontological corollary to Husserl's subject of experience, except instead of conscious awareness, it's being in the world. So I don't know, how does that strike you, Eric? Does that sound, yeah.
Yeah. I like it. It kind of still leaves open, like, again, I think there's a few points in this text where we find that Dasein is quite close to the subject, in terms of its function and definition. Although, and again, in the passage we read, he's explicit, right? Dasein is neither substance nor subject. But, just to really hash it out, though, like, as I was thinking about it the past couple of days, there's so many conceptions of the subject that have kind of been held up and interrogated over the course of Western philosophy, but not just that, in German idealism and many of its, later thinkers of the tradition. So I don't know. I mean, again, I think this is probably a subject for more like conversation and investigation. But I suspect Heidegger has in mind when he's protesting, he's like, Dasein is not a subject. He has a particular conception of subject that he's saying it's not that, but that there might be other conceptions of subject that we still, having looked more closely at Hegel than Heidegger did at the time that he wrote this, or what have you, that we have a different notion of subject that for us, when we bring that to bear on the text, we find it a little bit more problematic. Or maybe even like Heidegger with his own later understanding, right? Like, again, from what Chase was saying earlier, and from stuff I've picked up elsewhere, it seems like the middle and late Heidegger is trying to refine things that were started in Being and Time, and that perhaps there's still a sense that he left a little bit of this kind of subject, traditional notion of the subject hanging out in the Being and Time that he was trying to extirpate. So again, it's a challenge for reading the text, right? Because he's trying to claim that Dasein is not subject or substance. In order to make sense of that, it would be helpful to know exactly what he means by subject, whether he's channeling Kant or Fichte or Hegel or Descartes or Locke. There's I don't know, degrees, shades of meaning, degrees of difference that could really shake out in terms of big difference for seeing where Heidegger is.
And that is something I am very much interested in seeing in the next few sections, because I noticed, in this, I guess it was the last section in this reading, and you've already mentioned, he says, self is neither subject nor substance, which, I took as maybe a shot at Hegel. who said substance is subject, but then he does mentions, and he's already talked about the they self, and so he's used the word self there. And then I noticed in this section he starts talking about self more, and then the very next section for next week is care and selfhood. And so I'm very much interested in what is self, because he has been so very careful in talking of Dasein, like you said, to steer it away from notions of subjectivity. Nevertheless, one of the fundamental features of Dasein is that it is structurally always a factical individual. It is always mine, right? I mean, mineness is a fundamental feature, a fundamental structural feature of Dasein, and then, this whole thing about death is what individuates us. So there's a strong individuation, something going on here. And then in this section, he starts using the word self, but then he has so far tried to distance this from a notion of subjectivity. So I think you're right. I think this is me just guessing too, that he's gonna, because he seems to want to retain the notion of self, but that he's going to define it in such a way that distances it in some ways from, for sure Descartes, but even maybe from some German idealism, but yet still retains some of that. Elsewise, why would he use the word self? So,
right. And I want to say, like, if we, to the best of my understanding, if we take him as his principal target as Descartes' conception of the subject, it seems like he's the rest of the text adequately kind of explains the distance that he's creating, and we can kind of see where it would, what he's pushing away from. And with the Kantian notion of subject, I want to say that it's a little bit more ambiguous. You could be, it depends on which reading of Kant we're talking about, you know what I mean? So there's you could be more charitable and kind of flesh out what Kant was kind of intending in the system, or the scope of his system. But if you just stick to what he said in the text, then we get a very kind of like, especially a conception of consciousness is like, primarily driven by theoretical kinds of thinking, you know what I mean? Well, I've talked about the practical, but even there, it takes the form of like a reason and syllogistic kinds of, and so you can see kind of what Heidegger is pushing away from. But then there have been other Kant scholars who said, but these are just the bones and the skeleton of a more fleshed out idea of the subject that of course has desires, of course, you know what I mean? And so there's room to argue like how accurate is, if he's pushing it back against Kant, how accurate is Heidegger's concept of subject that he's using to push back against Kant? And then there was something I read recently from Fichte, where he was building from Kant and trying to say something more about an ontological status of the subject. And the way, I forget the line it was, but it really put me in mind of Heidegger, because it was like he was explicitly saying we need to realize that this I that posits itself does so kind of with like feelings and desires and thoughts as well. You know what I mean? But when we think of our being as such, that's a mode of being. When we come to our, the self-consciousness as a mode of thinking of our being, which isn't exhaustive of our being as a self, that sounded like that's right up Heidegger's alley right there. And to me, that's Fichte, just, Fichte almost saying by definition, as soon as you evoke a self, you're evoking a subject. But again, that's a Fichtean notion of subject, which Heidegger may not be in his orbit as he's, drawing this distance. I don't know.
Yeah, another thing, I mean, this makes me want to be a little more sympathetic to Tristan when he was, a few weeks ago was like, why is everyone so jazzed about Heidegger? Because most of this is already there in Fichte. And, maybe some of that's true. And, another one of those things that I remember from Fichte is he says that the body is a transcendental condition for the possibility of self-consciousness, because self-consciousness necessarily has to have an other, and the self-positing I does have an other, but it's this abstract other. It's not, it's just like it's like a potentiality for experiencing what is not the self is already built into it. But that doesn't turn into concrete real consciousness until it has a body in a world. Well, again, that sounds a bit like Heidegger. You've got to be in the, or maybe even like Merleau-Ponty, you've got to be a body in a world in order for this abstract consciousness to actually, I don't know what, kind of become aware in some more profound sense.
And I would say that's a Fichtean kind of articulation of something that is kind of, I don't know, more subterranean in Kant.
Hmm.
The idea that as a precondition for having experience, we need to be finite,
Oh,
right? For the kinds of discursive experience that we have, right? It's an experience from within finitude, right? So because we have limits, because we can pose limits on things, this is a precondition for our experiencing the world in the way that we do.
so I've got actually a book that I've never read. I've got so many books I've never read. I got this because when I was in graduate school, there was a group of people that were going to read this, and we met like twice and never, never got any further. But that's maybe only a few of us would be interested, but that would be an interesting book for
Right.
me. And
Yeah.
then you would probably find out, someone who knows Kant well would probably be able to identify places where, it's not really what Kant said.
Or there's the orthodox interpretations, and then there's the Heideggerian. I mean, because at the time he's writing too, Heidegger's writing, there are competing schools of neo-Kantianism,
Hmm.
and he's reacting against the two major ones, and explicitly not being a neo-Kantian. But like I've said, he and others, I mean, it's easy to point out, being in time is chock full of Kantian influence.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, it's also an interesting question, like, begs, further conversation another time. Like, how much can you depart from an original thinker and still bear that as a label or as a moniker? You know what I mean? Like, I've been thinking about arguments, like the argument between myself and Hunter with regard to reading Hegel. And what is Zizek doing? You know what I mean? What is Adorno doing? And to what extent is Zizek Hegelian? Or is he just appropriated Hegel, right? And what does it mean to be a Hegelian? How faithful do you have to be? To what extent, right? And I think that's an operative question here too.
Yeah. I was going to make a comparison just because I have to, as Chase would said, fill in my bingo card. Like when you were saying, when Heidegger says, I don't think he would say it this strongly, but when I'm trying to, let's say maybe distance myself from the notion of subjectivity, what does he mean by subjectivity? And there may be a way of, he may have an idea of subjectivity that actually is, really is subjectivity. It's just maybe a bit distant from, some more recent or traditional interpretations, but it's still a notion of subjectivity. And I was thinking there's a similar thing with Nietzsche, that one of the things I tried to argue was that not just me but others have, that the will to power is a metaphysical thesis or cosmological thesis. But then what people say is, yeah, but he explicitly says he's not doing metaphysics. My rebuttal to that is he's rejecting traditional substance metaphysics. Like you said, he's rejecting this kind of metaphysics. When he says we should throw out metaphysics, because he still makes metaphysical claims. He still makes claims about what kinds of things exist. And so what can he possibly mean? Well, I think he just means what metaphysics has meant up to this point is substance ontology. I'm going to pitch that. But that doesn't mean he doesn't have any metaphysics. And maybe something similar going on with Heidegger. I'm going to pitch subjectivity, but then, like you said, maybe he means a certain conception of subjectivity, especially Cartesian, maybe some other stuff.
Right. And even there, he's not necessarily pitching it as so much like framing it, or you know what I mean, within a certain kind of, again, a framework, a theory, if you like, an ontology where this conception of the subject might be valid within a ontic kind of configuration or whatever, but he's after something more fundamental or primordial, which again, like might lead us back to another version of the subject, right? That's what's kind of at stake.
Yeah, one reason I'm particularly interested is I've been reading Matthew Squire's master's thesis, and he's drawing a lot from Rick Roderick, whom I don't know a lot about, but apparently he's got a tremendous amount. One thing I've noticed, let's see, Ed's really knows this because he's older, and I don't know, probably you too, Eric. But I don't know if you guys have noticed how much these younger guys get stuff off of YouTube. They just that's a primary source of information is YouTube lectures and videos, which isn't necessarily bad. I mean, I typically go to written sources. They go to YouTube as their sort of first cut. And there's a lot of videos of Rick Roderick lectures, who is, I don't know, he was a continental philosopher somewhere, I can't remember. I guess fairly well respected. But anyway, he's drawing a lot from Rick Roderick's interpretation of Heidegger. And I'm questioning some of Roderick's interpretations, which is that's hubris on my part because I don't know Heidegger that well. But one of the things he really goes on and on and on about is he keeps using the word self in connection with Heidegger. I keep wanting to say Heidegger would not say that but I think on a more careful reading, it is this problem that maybe he may actually be using the word self in a true Heideggerian way, but that when I think the word self, I'm thinking something like Cartesian self. And then maybe he's thinking of, no, this phenomenological self, which is not the same thing. So, in fact, because of this, I've tracked down a couple of papers, and one of them is I don't know the person who wrote it, but he goes through these different conceptions of self. He talks about Descartes' notion of self, and then it seems like there's another one, and then he talks about the narrative self and Ricoeur. I don't know anything about Ricoeur, but basically self as a story, and that completely makes sense. And I thought of the phenomenological self as being like the self of the story, but then what he points out is then when you get to phenomenology, this notion of mindness becomes primary, this notion of individuation. And so I haven't finished reading that article, but anyway, it just seemed relevant because that's a big, I don't know, I honestly don't know enough about Husserl to know if Husserl concerned himself with this issue of individuation, but it's clearly a primary concern of Heidegger's.
When you say individualization, Nevitt, what do you?
So you can talk about, so for example, when, again, I don't know any of these guys well, so I may say something stupid, but when Husserl's talking about consciousness, he's talking about it in a very general kind of way. Like when he wants to know what are the structures of consciousness, he doesn't mean what are the structures of my consciousness or of your consciousness, or he wants to know what are the structures of consciousness per se.
Right, in a general way, right?
Yeah,
be applied to all human beings.
Exactly.
Right.
And Dasein is like that for Heidegger as well. When he's talking about Dasein, he's talking about this kind of being per se. But then one of the features of Dasein is that it is always it is always individualized as a particular individual. And that's so what I mean by mindness, because Heidegger, he said, he started way back when, I always experience this being as mine. And then that's why he, in this part of this book, he's trying to, well, where does that sense of mindness come from? And he's ultimately tagging it toward this being toward death. But so that's what I was saying. I don't know if Husserl ever addresses that's what I mean by individuation, this sense of how do these general forms of consciousness, how are they individuated into particular persons in particular places in the world?
I haven't read a lot of Husserl, so feel free to say nice try, Ed, but shut up. But my sense of Husserl is that I don't think he would I don't think he could I don't think he would think that anybody could say what does that mean across the board, because yes, we're all born, right? We all go through the process of birth. We are very helpless. There are certain commonalities of very young life, but the for lack of a better term, the order of our experiences, our relationship with close family members, where environmentally are we being raised, how many brothers or sisters, if any, are part of the family unit. I would think that Husserl would feel a little uncomfortable to say we all have memory, thought, emotion. I don't remember all of the list that he had of what constitutes consciousness, but we still may not experience all of that. It's like a family of, and when I say family, I mean like a family of terms, right? Then not a literal biological family, but that each person's consciousness, even if we can say everybody's consciousness is a consciousness of something, doesn't necessarily mean that the consciousness of that thing is going to be the same in terms of like affection, of like, do we view it positive and negative, right? My memory is fairly strong. Other people's memory is, for lack of a term, much weaker. How the two of us might experience the same movie at the same time is going to be different, where I could talk about it 5 years later and the person I saw it with couldn't tell me what happened the next day. Does that make sense? And I think Husserl was, I don't want to say aware of that, but that was part of his understanding of consciousness, because it was, even if you could say something about human consciousness, you're still talking about individual persons' consciousnesses.
Yeah, but I think that would all be part of, if you talk, about individual, like I said, individual experience. But what he was primarily looking for, I mean, he used the word objectivity. So maybe here's one of the puzzles for a phenomenologist. I mean, this is true actually it's true for Kant, and I think I'm guessing Husserl gets this drive for discovering the fundamental structures of consciousness from Kant. So if you think about that, if you start with a sort of a Cartesian point of view, in the sense that what I can know best is what appears within my own consciousness, and what you can know best appears within your own consciousness. Well, then the question is, why is there any objective truth at all? Because you would think that if I have my own consciousness and you have your own consciousness, and in some sense I'm enclosed, captured within my own experience, and you are captured within your own experience, what is the ground of any commonality? And even more fundamentally, is there any true objectivity, like things that are any knowledge that is truly objective? And so Kant's move, and I think Husserl's is similar, is to say there are certain fundamental structures of consciousness that are exactly the same for every conscious being. These are they're not specifics like how I feel about that or how I feel about that. There's just fundamental structures that there are these structures that give form and structure to my experience of the world as such. And for like take it real for Kant, I'm not sure about Husserl, but take for Kant space and time. Well, space and time for Kant are, quote, subjective in the sense that I experience space and time this way and you experience it that way. But as a matter of fact, the space and time are grounded in this transcendental subjectivity, this sort of background subjectivity. And the way that I structure space and time and the way that you structure space and time are exactly the same. And so the ground of objectivity is not that there is an external world out there that is independent of my consciousness. No, my consciousness structures my reality for me. But why do we have a common objective ground? Well, it's because our consciousnesses fundamentally have the same structural features. And that's what I mean by Husserl was trying to explore kind of empirically. I mean, he had a weird methodology, but kind of empirically probe the fundamental structures of consciousness itself. And that was a big part of his project, was trying to discover those. I mean, he was concerned, like Kant, with what is the ground of objectivity? Given that we start with an subjective awareness, why is there any objectivity at all? I mean, that's Kant's concern, and I think it's one of Husserl's primary motivations as well. Reading this thing that...
Yeah, sorry, the first one is directly from the Critique of Pure Reason, just highlighting again the mindness that's baked into the synthetic unity of apperception. Again, I feel like he's not invented this whole cloth, right? He's inherited this from the tradition. He's doing different work. He's giving it an existential kind of ontological, meaning, but or focus on the mindness as such. But and then the second one, the title, The Struggle Against Subjectivism, is just echoing what you were saying. It is not the case that Husserl or Kant are falling into a form of subjective consciousness is all the way down, or solipsism, but precisely to get away from that. Yes, you know what I mean? Like what we know is the direct contents of our experience, but we can't stop there, right? The problem is, how do we get from the direct contents of our experience to knowledge about the laws of nature, right?
Mathematics.
Kantian concern.
Yeah, I mean, Husserl was a mathematician,
right?
And Kant was really big into mathematics, and so a big deal for them is, well, why is mathematics objective? If we are trapped within our subjective consciousness, why is mathematics objective? And then why does the world have the same basic structure for all of us? So yeah, I mean, I think my way of thinking about this is sort of the aftermath of Descartes and Hume, because Descartes says, well, if what I know best is my subjective conscious awareness, how the hell do you ever get out of this? This solipsistic world. And Descartes has to invoke God to do it. And so, so like all these guys after that, Kant and the German idealists and the phenomenologists, they're all basically worried about that same problem. If what we know most immediately is this, then what is the ground of objectivity?
So are you saying then Heidegger, there is no ground of objectivity?
Well, for him, it's Dasein. So, because so for Husserl's trying to figure out what are the fundamental structures of consciousness, Heidegger's trying to figure out what are the fundamental structures of being. So, Dasein is always individuated, but Dasein as such, this is why he's got the difference between the ontological and the ontic. When he's describing the ontological structure of Dasein, at least in Being and Time, and maybe this changes later, but at least in Being and Time, he's concerned with ontological structures that are in fact common for every Dasein. So that's where, at least the Heidegger of Being and Time, these they're not categories because this is his technical vocabulary. The word category only applies to things, types of being that are not Dasein. In the case of Dasein, what would be categories he calls existentials. So existentials are the categories of being that are common to every Dasein. And so when he's laying out these things like care and temporality and all of these big technical words that he's laying out, at least in Being and Time, I think he is saying these are objective in that sort of Kantian sense, that they are the fundamental structures of being for every Dasein.
Okay, can I ask a rude question then? How is that different from a physicist saying there is this world external to our observations of it? Even if we don't say Pluto is a planet, there is an object that we have given the name Pluto to that orbits the sun, and that there are planets, there are comets, Kepler's laws of planetary motion. How is Heidegger's assertion of the Dasein existing as it does, as we're understanding it, how is that not asserting something to be objectively true?
Well, I mean, again, from what you were saying about with a physicist, just dogmatically asserting the existence of an external world, right? That's a version of naive realism, right? And from my understanding, Heidegger's not going to assert the existence of a world independent of Dasein. Like Dasein is a condition for the possibility of a world.
Yeah, but he's asserting this thing called Dasein exists,
Right.
and it exists for every single person, does it not?
No, I think with this one on Heidegger, the proof is in the experience of the reader, right? Like, what brings you to this book? What, you know what I mean? Like when you entertain these thoughts, do you recognize these thoughts as your own thoughts? If you can't recognize that you exist, at least in some minimal sense of objectively present, but also, maybe beyond that in terms of like as a unique individual facing their own death, that nobody else can die in your stead. If you can't follow these kinds of things, then yeah, it's going to be lost on you. But I think a lot of like what Heidegger's proof of Dasein is that you're reading this.
Well, then, but couldn't that be proof? Couldn't anything be proof of Dasein? Anything that I'm doing, because I'm doing it, I made the choice to do it, then that's proof of Dasein.
Yes. I mean, he's trying to assert something of a world of meaning over against a traditional model, which has been, asserting a world of substance, of things.
But that would suggest, begging your pardon, but everything exists the way it does because that's the way it had to be, because it's the sum total of millions upon millions upon billions upon trillions of individual choices.
I don't know if it's a fatalistic like ancient world of meaning, and like the essence, the meanings of things are their essences.
No, but what I mean is you chose to read Kant a while ago and to continue reading him in secondary literature, and that's informing what you're doing now. But the way you describe Heidegger's sense of Dasein, and you use the example of, well, we're reading this, or I'm reading this book, therefore, ta-da, Dasein exists because I chose to read this book. And to me, that then that couldn't you have to then extrapolate that and say, well, that's why. I mean, Nevin might be reading it for a different reason, but he is reading it. The act of reading Heidegger, there's a number of people who are doing that. And even if it is inherent in our design to do it, well, then that means, wasn't it inevitable that we were going to be reading Heidegger being in time?
I I don't know that again, I don't know that he's going to be a fatalist on that. He does seem to talk about freedom. I guess more to the point, like if what I was going to say, what I kind of related to what I was saying earlier. If we're thinking about the physicist's claim of an external world as something that needs proof, right? And until we get that kind of proof, it's a dogmatic form of naive realism. Um, then we're looking at Heidegger and his claim, ontological claim that of Dasein, that we're gonna investigate the meaning of being, but in doing so, we're gonna take primarily what's closest to us, which is ourselves, and take Dasein as the thematic for the ontological inquiry into the meaning of being. Again, the way he then goes to explicate what he means by Dasein and what his project is, if you follow his conception of Dasein up to a point, it becomes almost like impossible or meaningless to pose the question, does Dasein really exist in the sense that Heidegger is talking about here? Are there really beings in the world that pose questions of meaning? You know what I mean? It almost becomes a performative contradiction. Like he's got you in already insofar as you're coming to the book and asking questions about meaning and existence.
But you were tying that to I thought you were tying it, Eric, to people's individual Dasein.
Well, ultimately, there's an individuation as part of everybody's Dasein, yes.
So and again, I'm really trying to understand it. So you have a Dasein, as do I.
Or not have would probably not be what I mean. I think Heidegger wants to say, I am. You know what I mean? And even with a definite article add Dasein almost gives it object status, right? But I am Dasein.
Turns it into an object, a present or
right.
a present at hand object. Yeah.
So I'm here in the world, thrown, lost, looking for meaning.
Right.
So here's the way I think about the scientific question. So if go think about it in terms of Husserl. Husserl, and this isn't an exact quote, but I had a student. I taught phenomenology and existentialism twice, and I had a student get up and walk out of the class after 2 weeks because I kept saying this thing because he thought it was so ridiculous. But Husserl says things like, "Without consciousness, there is no world." Well, that sounds ridiculous because if you eliminated somehow, I mean, let's say that this planet is the only place in the universe where there are conscious beings, and we all went extinct. Well, there's still going to be a world, but I think Husserl's point is that the term world, that term, only has meaning for beings who have consciousness. And so if you say, what is the world without there being conscious beings to experience it, there is something, but you're abusing the language when you say there is a world without conscious beings, because the term world has no meaning. And so conscious beings, and so his claim is, the sort of Kantian Husserlian claim is that all beings like us have this form of consciousness, and we are all going to structure that world in fundamentally the same way because there are these background structures of consciousness that give rise to these structural features of our experience. And I think Heidegger's making the same kind of claim, phenomenological claim, but it's with regard to being instead of consciousness. So Dasein, every Dasein has the same fundamental, the being, our being is structured in fundamentally the same way, according to certain fundamental structures, temporality, resoluteness, all these kinds of things. And his evidence for that is this book. So this book is it's, to use sort of a Kantian thing, it's almost like a transcendental deduction in that given that we have this, this is so Kantian the way he does this. Given that we have this kind of experience in being, so the transcendental argument for Kant is, given that I have this kind of experience, what background structures must already be in place simply for me to be able to have this kind of experience? And those are the transcendental conditions, the background conditions that have to be in place simply for me to have an experience like this. And those background conditions are the same for every being with this kind of consciousness. So Heidegger's making, I think, the same kind of move, except in the domain of being, and saying, that my observations are that there are certain fundamental ways every human person experiences being in the world. In order for all of us to have this kind of experience of being, what must be the background structures that are already in place for our world to have this kind of ontological structure? And those are the existentials, that technical term, the categories of Dasein. And so his claim is, like Kant's, like Husserl's, that there are these fundamental ontological structures that give ontological structure to my world and to your world. And again, later he seems to historically relativize these. They're not relative between, Daseins in a particular culture, but he seems to say that they do change over time. But in being in time anyway, he seems to be thinking, no, they're the same for all people, all times, all places. And then if you ask, how is this different from scientific realism? Well, the scientists are going to say, naive scientific realism says, if you took out every person in the world, in the universe, nothing would change in the structure of being, because the structure of being is what it is independently of conscious beings or anything else. The phenomenological move is to say, there's no way for you to know that. How could you possibly say that? Because when you say, what is the structure of being without Dasein, you are a Dasein. That's not, like Eric said, that's not the right way to speak. But this is from the perspective of Dasein that is asking, what would the world be without Dasein? Whatever I come up with in my imagination is always going to be reflective of the way I experience the world as this being. So if I imagine a world without Dasein, I'm already imagining the world with Dasein, because Dasein is imagining that world. You cannot possibly imagine a world absent you, because it's you having this imaginary experience. And since you have this structure being of Dasein, whatever world you imagine is already going to be structured in the way that Dasein structures it. So to ask what the world is like absent Dasein is a nonsense question. There's no way to know that. And go ahead.
No, I was going to make the same point, but I think in a slightly different way. I think if we follow Heidegger's meaning, again, Dasein is one of the ways of being, right? And then the kinds of thingly, a present at hand objects is another kind of being. And if you ask it the question in a traditional way, what would the world be like? Would the world persist if all of humanity wiped itself out and there was no human consciousness as such? And if you were to say, follow from that, well, nothing would fundamentally alter in terms of the structure of being of the universe, then I think Heidegger's response is, because you can only say this because you've started out with an impoverished notion of being. For you, the only types of being is substances, things, ready, present to hand, occupying a definite amount of space, the physicist worldview. Those are the only kinds of beings that you encounter and you countenance, right? This is not Dasein, though. Dasein is the kind of being that has projects, is thrown into the world, is looking to meaningfully engage with others. When we say, okay, that's an important element of the structure of being, and you eliminate all human beings from the earth, right, and all consciousness from the universe, you can no longer say, well, then nothing is changed in the structure of being, extant being, right? Because you've eliminated all the Dasein and left only, bare substance being. Does it make, yeah.
And that bare substance being is, in Heidegger's view, is a derivative kind of being.
Right.
So, the non-phenomenological scientist, which I assume is most of them, is going to say the world is just a collection of things that sit around in space and time, and they have certain spatial and temporal relations with each other. What Heidegger is going to say is ultimately we are the beings who are coming up with that, and our fundamental experience of being is not like that. The fundamental, the most primordial, immediate experience of being is this ready to hand kind of being, where you're like Eric said, where you're involved with projects and you're doing things, and we experience these beings as kind of extensions of our projects and so on. That's the real, quote, objective. It's not, I mean, he wouldn't use that word, but that's the real primordial being. And then that's why I say he kind of flips the script on this other kind of ontology, this notion of an objective world that is completely separate from Dasein is an interpretation that is ultimately grounded in that more primordial sense. And it's not a bad interpretation. It's extremely useful. If we didn't have that interpretation, we couldn't build bridges and put men on the moon. And it's got, but the interesting thing is that for Heidegger, that whole scientific world is a project among other projects. It is just another kind of project. It is a projection of the being of Dasein onto the world. And that particular project has as its objective usefulness, being useful for doing certain kinds of activities. And so the whole scientific project is not without value. It's just that it's a derivative project, a particular kind of project, one among many projects that Dasein generates. And it is extremely useful for certain purposes.
It's incomplete. It's incomplete by itself, right? It's in many ways it's woefully incomplete because of when both of you were talking, and I think I'm understanding it, is what I was trying to do is not say that there's I'm begging your pardon, no human being on the earth, if you'll permit me to say the earth. But what would a person's experience be if they were the proverbial last person on earth? Right.
Well, has this person been living in a society prior to this?
Yes.
Well, then there's still going to be Dasein.
Oh yeah. No. But what I mean is, I apologize. This is a huge stretch, but I can imagine the person's project, if he or she is by themselves, literally the last person on earth, is going to be radically different than if they're on earth when we have 8 billion people. You know what I'm trying to say? I mean, the lack of all these other persons, I should say, is going to radically change that person's life and project and how he or she is, begging your pardon, viewing the world, right? I mean, and then that makes sense to me because that to me was like a halfway house between the way we are now and also, what you said is impossible because the world, the concept doesn't exist without human beings describing and in all manifold different kinds of ways even in the scientific world, right? There's going to be different descriptions of the quote unquote same phenomenon. But what I was thinking is, if you are the last person on Earth, even with a Dasein, think of how many things would be unimportant.
So I don't know, Eric, did you want to?
No, go ahead.
So what I was going to say is, because that person had grown up in this world, they would be again, I probably shouldn't say a Dasein, but they would structure, that person would structure being in the same way that Dasein has, because they would have been embedded in that world long enough to continue to do that. So they would experience the world of things and beings and all that pretty much like they always had. What would be different is, like you said, is that suddenly, maybe the way to put it would be the world of facticity would be radically altered. The world of the restrictions upon their projects. So part of what it means to be thrown into a world is to be thrown into a world of limitations, that, my projects are my possibilities, let me put it that way. My possibilities are constrained. I don't have infinite possibilities, but they're constrained by, all sorts of social factors, biological factors, cultural factors. So then what would happen is, I think that person would still experience the world in much the same way, at least initially. But as they are Dasein and they're projecting themselves into the future in these projects, the character of that is going to be radically altered. And my guess is, over time, that person might experience the world in a significantly different way, as they lose, because they're no longer embedded in this they world, they're no longer embedded in this cultural world. And so their experience of the world may begin to shift and alter pretty dramatically over time. I think initially it wouldn't, but yeah, I would think that over time they would experience the world could potentially very differently.
Yeah, I want to say, kind of following from that too, like it, and again, I don't know how accurate this is, but as I've, been reading this and making sense of it, it seems to me like that, again, a good correlation, at least for making sense, is when Heidegger addresses the ontological as distinct from the ontic, he seems to be engaged in a motive inquiry, like a transcendental inquiry about what must be the case. And so it's operating again on the force of necessity, which a lot of, again, he's drawing from a tradition here, Descartes, others, it must be the case. Kant, it must be the case that. So it's really necessity and not contingency. But the ontic seems to be a realm of contingency. So what he describes as ontological must be the case, but what he describes as ontic or factual, right, can or cannot be the case. And just loosely, right? To use the analogy from Kant, right? Like the transcendental categories, right? It is, according to Kant, right? In order to experience any object whatsoever as an object, you must recognize this object as either a unity, a plurality, or a totality. Must be one of them. You know what I mean? It just by logical, right? Logical kind of necessity. It must be one of these, right? And so on. It must be spatial or temporal. It must be subject to cause and effect. And it must be. And for you to, experience the kind of objects that you have, they must conform to these categories, according to Kant. Now, he doesn't say anything about triangles. You know what I mean? Doesn't say anything about the particular kinds of objects which one may or may not encounter. That's up to the, up for empirical investigation. He's more concerned with the a priori transcendental conditions as such. And so what I see Heidegger doing here, he's concerned with the ontological, structures of Dasein. And a lot of kind of what we're throwing up is, well, what if this, what if this? These are just different kind of contingent possibilities that are all still consistent with what Heidegger's laying down as an ontological necessity. So if you're the last person on Earth, I want to say all of Heidegger's ontology can still apply, But ontically, right, or factically, it's a very different game. You're gonna have a different experience of finding meaning. You're gonna have a real struggle of finding meaning. You're gonna have angst, but it's gonna take a different flavor being the last person on Earth. And it won't be a fundamentally different angst than what you and I are having, in the modern era. But it'll be contingently different. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Well, think of it. I mean, and it might be, silly science fiction movies, things like that. But when many times you'll see, like, when a person is used to being part of some type of society and then is thrown on their own resources by themselves, prototypical shipwreck, or, now in sci-fi, the Omega Man scenario, with a terrible virus that wipes out everybody. You said, we would probably still have angst, even if it would be somewhat different. Our whole lives have been embedded in multiple network structures of other human beings. Well, now you're by yourself. I mean, for a lot of, again, I'm taking but I could see why someone, yeah, right. I agree, Nevin. Libertarians don't get that at all. Thank you, Ayn Rand. But that our lives are there's a presupposition in well, let me say it this way. Isn't there even a presupposition in Heidegger that there's going to be more than one person on the earth in the future, with Dasein, with being thrown in the world, with having projects, that there's this sense that there are going to be multiple communities of people? And what would it mean to be a true Heideggerian and be the last person on earth?
I mean, I think what Heidegger would say, he's as a phenomenologist, he's not trying to describe the objective conditions of existence absent us.
Right.
He's trying to actually give a phenomenological account of being for beings like us. And so, if something happened in the population of the world, or, like, let's say you had one family now, and you've got, Adam and Eve.
Flood. Let's
What's
call it a
that?
flood.
Yeah, the flood. And then Heidegger, and Heidegger is one of the sons, one of the sons of Noah, and he tries to do an ontology, a few years after that. It's going to be completely different. I mean, he might still be able to do Dasein, but it's, the structure, the way, because the relation, I don't know, I don't think it'd be completely different. But anyway, it would be different because, the conditions of the phenomenological conditions of that kind of existence would be different.
Right. And I wasn't making fun of him with my question. I hope you know that. It to me, it would be a very and maybe from Heidegger's point of view, it would be a completely useless intellectual exercise. But what would be a Heideggerian sense of project if, as you said, we expand it beyond one person, but it's still an extraordinarily small number of persons?
Or say you take another science fiction scenario of you have a small group of people who go and populate Mars, or a small group of people who go someplace else. And I do not at all denigrate. I mean, philosophers have a long history of thought projects, and or thought experiments, and that's exactly the purpose of thought experiments, is to test these theories. And I mean, I think that would be, someone who understood Heidegger and who was a good fiction writer. That would be a really interesting kind of thing to pursue. Is what kind of Heideggerian analysis would you come up with in that kind of a situation. Or imagine a culture of a type of alien whose social structure is very different from ours. What kind of Heideggerian world would you get there? And personally, one reason I like science fiction and some fantasy is because I think really good science fiction is, speculative fiction is really thought experiments with that kind of thing where they say, well, think about something like uh, what's the William Golding novel about the boys on the island?
Oh yeah,
Flies.
Lord of the Flies.
Lord of the Flies.
That's a thought experiment.
Yeah.
It's a fictional story, but it's a thought. The Walking Dead, frankly, is a thought experiment.
Right.
And as that series went on, the zombies became less and less important because they were just kind of shambling, slow. They're not really much of a threat. But what became the real threat were human beings in the absence of civil government. And so I think the kind of things you're proposing are not silly. I think they're actually interesting thought experiments or thought projects.
Yeah, because I was trying to be. Thank you very much, because I'm glad you thought that, because that was my intent. Not to just have a parlor game, but to really, because if every, and tell me if I'm saying this incorrectly, if every person has a design and has a project, then that would be true, no matter how few human beings were on this planet.
Yeah, and I think that's true, but the I don't know. I don't. I'm kind of talking outside what I really know, but the kinds of projects that are available to a person would be very different.
Oh yeah.
Provided
But,
they were socialized. You know what I mean? Again, like I think we have to put out the possibility that they're feral. You know what I mean? Like that's just it's difficult to even like, or do we apply the word human? You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
so we're just taking it as kind of like the human consciousness. And I think I Nevin, again, like going to fiction, I was thinking the same thing, right? Again, I've been looking at, as I've been reading Being in Time again, I've been thinking about The Stranger. I think there were a couple times where I mentioned it, it like helps to think of Meursault and what Camus was doing with Meursault as an expression of existentialism, which is borrowing heavily from Heidegger. So it's there. You know what I mean? I'm sure it's, got some idiosyncrasies that are belong to Camus, but it really lends itself at certain points, you know what I mean, to making sense of Being in Time, to think of Marceau's character. But also, just that use of fiction here is kind of like, what would, how can we make sense of Heidegger? But also when Ed was asking, what would Heidegger say? Like, you didn't pose it this exact way, but what would Heidegger say to the last person on Earth? They're like, last person on Earth, I have what? Projects? No projects? Like, what do you mean projects? I'm the last person on Earth. It's all fucking meaningless here, And I think Heidegger would recognize, like, well, I'm just guessing. This is a stab in the dark, right? But I think would say, well, part of you probably wants to shoulder the burden of like leaving some kind of lasting legacy for humanity, to scratch something into some last tombstone in case some space travelers ever come upon this, or you want to leave something and you feel the burden of your entire species. And that would be inauthentic. Don't do that. Just face up to your own death. And that's all you need to worry about. And I can see, in my mind, Heidegger would be very much like a Hemingway here. You know what I mean? Like, do your thing. Do your thing. You know what I mean? Go blow up the bridge and take yourself with it. You know what I mean? Because that's how you can face your own end with dignity. Even though you're the last one, face up to the fact that you too will die, and don't try to make it special. Well, I mean, make it your own, but don't make it, a statement for your species.
Well, make it a statement for yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
But again, I don't know that Heidegger was ever posed that question. I'm just imagining.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think within the scope of his ontology, with what he's trying to do, he's not interested in that kind of question. But I think it's a useful thing to probe the boundaries and the limits of anything, ethical ideas, epistemological ideas, ontological ideas, because you can learn something. I mean, so that kind of question, I think, makes you think about Heidegger's ontology in a different kind of way. And I think that's useful. So like looking at those limit cases. That's why I say, speculative fiction is really good at that, looking at limit cases,
Yeah.
which may be what The Strangers is doing in some ways, looking at a kind of limit case. So, Ed, why don't you write that novel?
Well, I would have to be much more comfortable that I thought I knew Heidegger so that I could write it from the inside out.
Yeah.
I don't feel anywhere near, so I'll have to. Oh, thank you for saying that though, because I've been meaning. I think I made a mistake in the translation of Heidegger's Being in Time that I asked for. Does the what did the office only order the exact number of the two different translations that the number had been sent to the philosophy department?
Yeah, I had specific people that I ordered specific translations for, because I mean, those who said they wanted a particular translation, I sent them that one, or I ordered one for them. And then those who said they didn't have them, I sort of arbitrarily picked, like Hunter, you're going to get the old, you're going to get the old one, and so and so, you're going to get the new one. So, but yeah, I ordered one of each book. I did not order multiple translations for single persons.
Because I think the one that because Chase was really bent out of shape over this was some weeks ago, but
Right.
the way the person translated and just thought that was beyond interpretation, that it was just
No, I'm going to push back on that.
oh really?
Yeah, I think that's Chase probably like I don't know. There's I don't know people that have been Heideggerians for a long time and they're quite partial to the language and the Macquarie and Robinson, and so they might just as a mode of preference be used to referring to those terms. Honestly, I find the Stambaugh to be very helpful as well. Like I've read the Macquarie and Robinson, and I see to put it briefly, I think part of their project was to also do what Heidegger did as a performance in the German language, to take kind of everyday language and render it in a way that it kind of comes across as uncanny, to get that feeling of the uncanny that he's trying to attack. I think Macquarie and Robinson try to do that in their translation.
Hmm.
And I think, and that's, and I think Stambaugh is more like, no, what is he really getting at? You know what I mean? And like what conceptually, let's just try to make this clear. You know what I mean? We're not going to try and go through the same performance that Heidegger did in the German language here in English, right? So I see Stambaugh as more straightforward in interpretation. I know there was Chase was getting annoyed with the objective presence as opposed to present at hand.
Oh, right.
You know what I mean? Like that's just to me, it's what it took him some time to learn readiness to hand and present to hand. And then to suddenly switch to another translation where the terms are different, that might be, if you're not familiar with that, you know what I mean? To my mind, there's no particular reason to be partial to present at hand and really hate objective presence. You know what I mean? I don't know. Yeah, that's right. Again, yeah.
So what translation are you both using?
I've been using the Stambaugh in this reading.
Me too.
Okay.
I mean, I have a copy of the old one, and I read some of it a long time ago, but I think Eric's right. I mean, the thing is the how do you pronounce it? Macquarie
and Robinson.
It was the only English translation for decades, and so its terminology became more or less standard, and so I think some people it's just hard to shift. It's there for so long that people begin to think of it as the correct terminology.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what's happened there.
I mean, I have a hard time keeping ready to hand and every time I say that, I have to think which one it is. It's just not. Whereas objective presence, I know what that means. And then handy,
Right.
that kind
Yeah.
of makes sense to me.
To me, the standby, the more often like antithesis to objective presence is inner worldliness or the
Mm,
inner worldly things. You know what I mean?
mm.
And again, that just indicates the meaningfulness, the significance of, you know, that kind of thing. So that, I mean, already like it's hard to confuse inner worldliness for presence, objective presence. It's hard to confuse objective presence for, you know what I mean, meaning and significance. So I think these are perfectly appropriate translations, you know?
Well, for some reason, I can't find the bloody thing. And so my dining room table looks like a paper factory exploded. But um, now that I know that you're both but I honestly don't remember.
Leads
Yeah,
on the,
that's the one I have.
yeah.
So I'm good. Okay.
Yeah.
Because I know I'm a civilian, but I really do take this very seriously. Um, uh, since the very beginning, I bumped into you lunatics with the earlier philosophy, and so I want to do right by what I'm reading because these are all just very serious works of philosophy, and they really bear. I mean, yes, to have a good time and you can joke, but I mean that these are just very serious works, and there should be some seriousness attached to it. So I'm glad this Stombog you both think is all right. So okay.
I find it easier to understand,
Okay.
frankly. I mean, this stuff is already so hard.
Yeah.
Like the stuff for today. I mean, what I usually do is I try to read it. I try to read the selection on Friday, and then sometime Monday I try to take half an hour to kind of go back through it. And usually on that second skim through, I feel like I understand it a little bit better. But it's still, I mean, there's some parts of this book I've read and I'm like, wow, I feel really good that I pretty much understand what he's saying. And then there's a lot of it like like the stuff for this week. I have a vague sense of what how he's connecting these concepts of resoluteness and anticipation and all that. I kind of got a general vague sense of what he's doing, but it's pretty vague. So this stuff is already hard enough that I just find Stambaugh easier. I feel like I get a little bit more understanding when I read her. So I'm going to stick with that one.
Yeah, if I was going to recommend to somebody who's reading Heidegger for the first time, I would unhesitatingly recommend the Stamball first. If you want to become a Heideggerian, then, then memorize Macquarie and Robinson. But
Yeah, and mostly for the reason that it has become the standard. It's the standard vocabulary, because it was there for so long. So, if you read papers on Heidegger, they're usually going to be using the terminology from the older translation.
Yeah.
I mean, that was one reason I think Hunter and one or two other of the guys, maybe Tristan, said they didn't have a preference. And since they are philosophy majors and they kind of are into this stuff, I got them the old one because I thought, if you want to be conversant with that old terminology, then you need that old edition. But
Yeah.
for everybody else, I got the Stambaugh, who didn't express a preference.
changing the topic, I had this thought earlier today, and then it just occurred to me that like it really fits nicely with some of Ed's musings earlier. So we were discussing what to do with the rest of the summer with regard to literature group, and I was going to suggest, like, I threw out there like we could read short stories, but I think I've said it before, like, and again, I don't know that many people are going to take. But anyway, I was just going to share. This was the thought I had today. Beckett's Endgame followed by a couple critical readings. Like, again, there's a famous Adorno, like, article or criticism analysis, Lovey analysis, fandom analysis of Endgame, Beckett's Endgame. And then I'm sure we can find an existentialist reading. I thought it would be fun to look at Endgame and then see what Adorno does with it and see what an existentialist would say about it and where they converge and where they differ. But I don't know if you're familiar with Beckett's Endgame. It is kind of you piece it together, it does seem like they're the last people on Earth, the last two people on Earth after some kind of apocalypse. And then somehow one of the characters' parents are kind of appear in trash cans. It's very absurd.
Yeah.
It's very avant-garde. It is an interrogation of meaning in a seemingly meaningless world, So you follow from Heidegger nicely. But
where
go ahead.
where is Beckett's Endgame compared to, chronologically speaking, compared to Waiting for Godot?
I want to say it's after Waiting for Godot.
Okay.
I just found a PDF of it online. It's mostly these two people talking in very, very short sentences.
Yeah.
Like pulling back the lids. One of these days I'll show them to you. It seems they've gone all white. What time is it? The same as usual. Have you looked? Yes. Well, 0. That's it's
If I remember correct, I stumbled over this accidentally. I think this is the correct philosopher's stage playwright. Do you know that Beckett met as a not Beckett as a teenager, but he met Andre the Giant? He was a professional wrestler. Did you ever, Nevin? Did you ever see The Princess Bride?
oh yeah, love that.
He's the Hulk of a mountain of a man.
Right.
Andre the Giant is actually French, and people and Andre the Giant didn't know Beckett is this world famous playwright. He's just this guy who I think Andre the Giant's father is building a cottage for. And Beckett takes a liking to Andre because he's so huge and everybody makes fun of him. And so he tries to, in his interaction with him in front of his fellow students, say, no, Andre's really great. And here's the reasons why, to try to have a change in their behavior and the way they talk to him. And it wasn't until I think Andre the Giant went to the United States and started his professional career that somehow he learned, oh shit, Samuel Beckett is huge. And all he thought of was he was a very nice man who took an interest in him. And but he was dealing with really a world-class intellectual of the 20th century. So that just always makes me smile. Like, in our world, when would you imagine Beckett and Andre the Giant meeting and actually interacting for some time?
Yeah, he seems to have been a real decent human being.
Yeah.
From everything I've seen. But there's also I don't know if I've shared with you this, there was an anecdote. I think some night he was walking home in Paris and some pimp stabbed him in the chest and he was hospitalized. And apparently, like, the next day the pimp came and apologized. It's like, I'm sorry, I didn't know what came over me. I must have been drinking too much or something to that effect. So, or like, I forget, maybe Beckett asked him, like, why did you do that? And that was the response, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. So then the guy gets pulled into court, has to answer to a judge for stabbing a guy. And Beckett appears in court and says, please be lenient on him. Like, I don't think he meant to do it. I don't think this is his character. You know what I mean? Basically just the very guy, the rando who stabs him in a Paris street, he's later going to appear in court and plead for leniency.
Yeah. No, that's amazing.
Well, given so many well-known people are such assholes, it's nice to have an exception. I mean, a lot, like we've talked about before, a lot of philosophers and a lot of creative people.
The creatives.
Yeah.
Well, do I need to vote again, or can you just mark down that I think Eric's idea is good?
Okay, so okay.
But I had said, why don't we just take a break? But I like the idea of having two different, and I don't think I've ever actually read anything Adorno, ugh, having a stroke now, that the Italian wrote. And so it'd be interesting to read Beckett and then read his reaction. But do you think you could get a existentialist, Eric, to comment on
I'll
Beckett?
poke around and see. Like,
Okay.
yeah, that was like again the thought that came up today, and I was like, yeah, I'm sure there's some other literary criticism of Endgame, non-Marxist, that
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, but and by the way, Adorno is I think that name was not the name he was born with, and it's also related to like his mother's lineage. So his mother or maybe maternal grandfather was Italian or something like that. There's Italian on that side, but he was German, born and raised.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah,
Oh, I did not know that.
yeah. And if you look at his sensibilities with regard to music,
Oh,
very
well.
German.
But wasn't where I thought he was incarcerated for years.
I think you're thinking of Gramsci,
I
and there's
am
a
thinking of, yes, I am thinking of Gramsci. That's right. That's right.
and
Sorry.
there's a lot of common themes between the two, but yeah, different.
So if I have found a PDF of Endgame, and then on JSTOR I found is this trying to understand Endgame by Adorno? Is that the one you're thinking about?
Yeah.
Okay, so I found a JSTOR PDF of that also.
Oh, that's great. I mean, that's we.
So what I could do is I could post those on Discord and then raise that as a suggestion. I mean, the thing is, nobody has to attend. And so, we could just say, well, some people really don't want to, but we've decided we're going to do this. And if you're interested, drop in. If not, that's fine too. I mean, it's not like I said, it's not a required class or something. So
Do you know how many acts Endgame is, Eric?
it's, I think
Two.
it's one.
Oh, it's a one act play.
Yeah.
Well,
And looking at the pages,
I mean, I know you have to read a play differently than, a novel short story, but still, if it's a play and it's one act, that's not a burden to read. And then I'm sure the article that you're referring to that Nevitt found, it's not going to be 75 pages. I mean, it's going to be an normal article length of, I don't know, 35 pages or whatever.
so the PDF that I found of the end game is 28 pages double columned.
Oh, okay.
And like I said, it's a lot of white space. So it's not, I mean, I'm sure the ideas are dense, but the text is not dense.
You might find that the ideas, I don't know, yeah, it's not like reading Heidegger or Hegel, but you'll be pausing, looking. You know what I mean? Like, wait, what? You know what I mean? It's not so much the words on the page that will give you questions, but what the words are not indicating that will give you questions.
Yeah,
Well,
I have
did
to be careful about how I read Faust because you can't read that stuff the way you read an essay. And then I imagine Beckett's is several
did,
levels more.
did you ever read the play by Tom Stoppard, the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead?
Two thumbs up.
Yeah, I read that when I was in the PhD program, and I was like, what did I just read?
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah.
One of my favorite films is the Tim Roth, Gary Oldman production
Yeah,
of
I thought they did a nice job with that. I wasn't sure how they could do it, but I think they were very yeah, no, I thought it worked really well.
They got Tom Stoppard in on the film production.
Oh, they did. Okay.
Yeah, they added a little bit, I think, from Tom Stoppard's input, but also I have to say, like, I've seen a few different productions. A high school production of it. There was a professional one in Edinburgh when I lived there. Obviously the Roth and Oldman. I've
Yeah.
seen a few. Again, I love that play, but the film production really, Richard Dreyfuss is. I've never seen anybody do the character of the player, better than Richard Dreyfuss, and he just seemed to be leaning into it and having so much fun,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
doing that role.
The Adorno article it says on JSTOR that it's 32 pages long.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
So Eric, were you thinking of I was wondering about like scheduling, like would you like do the whole play in one meeting and then or
You know, two. I was thinking maybe two, but I don't know.
yeah. Well, we can I'll go ahead and post both of those on Discord, and then if you find something from an existentialist perspective, let me know, and then I don't know, we can chat about it and try to figure out how we would schedule it.
Yeah, there's plenty of like critical commentary. I mean, I thought it would be fun to find something very explicitly existent, like even if we had Sartre like writing on Endgame, that would be awesome. But I'm sure there's lots of others that have kind of see themselves as existentialists and have written on Endgame. Beckett is one of the favorites of the later existentialists, but as well as of Adorno, who wasn't quite existentialist.
And
I like
quite a
that.
few.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I beg your pardon. I was just saying I like that idea.
Just skimming through the Adorno article,
It's harder to read than Endgame.
yeah, but what I was going to say is there are quite a few excerpts from the play in the article, so I don't know how much of the 32 pages is excerpts because what he does is he'll give like a half a page excerpt from the play and then talk about it. So he repeats parts of the play within the article. And then there are articles about Adorno's article on the Endgame.
Right.
Of course.
So, okay, well, I'll start posting some of that stuff. I hope this was helpful
Oh
tonight.
yeah. No, thank you very much for doing this. I learned a lot.
And hopefully at least we'll have one more next time. We'll see.
Yeah, I wonder what happened with Chase there.
I don't know. I posted on Discord on a personal message asking him if he was okay, but he hasn't responded yet. So
Oh, who knows? I mean, that one time I left very early, it was abruptly, and like someone knocked on my front door.